But our topic tonight is From Jesus to Christian Militancy. And we'll try to cover, just 2,000 years of history and development with and very rapidly. So we'll see if we're able to hit it all. So one of the reasons why we ended up doing this particular topic, or we decided to explore this particular topic, is in my own denomination here, Community of Christ. We are having next year our triennial World Conference. And so this is, if you've ever looked at the back of the wall here, we have the picture of what's this vast kind of auditorium. The auditorium is where representatives or delegates from all of the different sections of the church around the world send their delegates every 3 years in order to consider legislation and essentially operate the denomination. So the denomination is, its governing body is elected delegates who come together and decide what the budget principles, rules, and all those kind of things. And so anyway, one of the propositions that is before our denomination is what's being called the nonviolence resolution. And so the European Mission Center, which is to say delegates to their conference, have forwarded this resolution to the World Conference for our whole church to be considering. And so I've been thinking about it because I'll be a delegate to this conference, and so as we're kind of thinking about it. And so the resolution that is before us in our denomination is this resolution for nonviolence, and I'll just read it quickly. Whereas Jesus taught in Matthew 5:44, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, and whereas no known Christian writings between 100 of the Common Era and 313 of the Common Era approve of Christian participation in warfare, and whereas the founding vision of Community of Christ, so our denomination, was of the peaceable kingdom of God on earth, a nonviolent Zion with economic justice for all, and whereas Community of Christ has been admonished from its earliest days to hear the words of the living Christ and listen again to the voice that calls us to the great and marvelous work of building the peaceable kingdom of God on earth, and whereas Community of Christ has a logo inspired by Isaiah 11, 1 through 10, there's the logo right there on the wall, that shows nonviolence as central to the way we conceive of peace. So in other words, the lion and the lamb, and then the motto peace, that's been our logo for over a century. Whereas Community of Christ today is called to become a prophetic people that embodies in the lives of its members the ministries of the temple through the pursuit of peace, reconciliation, and healing of spirit. And whereas Community of Christ's enduring principles and mission initiatives, so one of the things that we do is we read the mission right at the beginning of this, and so one of those missions is peace through all creation and embody God's love for all creatures, whereas previous World Conference resolutions 1177, 1216, and 1227 have supported nonviolent methods of establishing peace, so very legalistic, right? That's how we do this. Therefore, resolved, and this is the strong resolve here that we're considering, that Community of Christ reject all forms of violence, including acts of terrorism, war, and financing wars, and act upon Christ's invitation to practice nonviolence, confront and resist injustice, and be it further resolved that Community of Christ reject the notion that violence on earth and violence against earth can be addressed separately, and affirm the importance of addressing the environmental causes of conflict, and be it further resolved that through its enduring principle of worth of all persons, Community of Christ opposes all ideologies of violence and injustice, including those expressed in diverse forms of nationalism, populism, racism, and bigotry, and be it further resolved that Community of Christ continue its support of peace education and invite its members to embody Christ's nonviolence through local, global, ecumenical, and interfaith actions toward justice and peace for all. So that's the resolution in front of us. In some senses, if you go back to the beginning here, though, reject all violence, including war and financing war, which is sort of the strongest, maybe most controversial parts denominationally. This is calling the church, which has become, we have been a peace-focused church, and peace has been our motto, it's been our principles, it's been our mission for well over a century, and yet we aren't officially part of the true peace churches like the Quakers and some of the other churches who are really, fully committed to nonviolence. And so this is kind of one of the things that's before us, whether or not we're going to do that. And so anyway, because of all these kind of whereases, or getting back into the nitty-gritty of the history of this movement and everything like that, we thought we'd look at it, and because it's a pressing thing for us today. So as always, we'll look at this evolution of ideas of nonviolence in Christianity, or peace, or warfare, and then how it got to militancy and all these kind of things by era, starting in this earliest era, early Christianities, where Christians are existing as diverse minority groups among a pagan majority or polytheist majority Roman Empire. From the 300s and 400s, Christianity as the first just the religion of the emperor, but also patronized by the emperor, and ultimately as the state religion that also doesn't allow, that outlaws actually the old religions within the empire. The church in the era of the invasions, so as in the West, the central state collapses, as the different barbarian confederations move in and establish the different Germanic kingdoms, and then all through what's commonly called the Dark Ages, but anyway, the period of time when Europe is experiencing a general collapse in terms of its capacity, state capacity, population, economics, every other kind of thing like that. What's going on there? The resurgence of the West into the High Middle Ages, where we also experience essentially the church that's known for its crusading ethics. Then Christianity divided by the Protestant schism, so the Protestant Reformation, the wars of religion in Europe, and then Christianity is now again in the post-Christian West. So as Westerners are still somewhat Christian sometimes, depending on, and in some cases, technically having like a lot of influence, let's evangelical vote in the United States and that kind of a thing. Nevertheless, in all vast portions of what's now called the West, as opposed to what used to have been called Christendom, it's in part because so few, for example, Europeans anymore are actually adherents to any particular Christian denomination in the post-Christian West. So anyway, looking at these whole vast ideas of these, we'll look at both kind of the histories, and we'll also try to look at some of the philosophical or theological underpinnings at different times. So turning to the early Christianities, we don't have, interestingly, I'm having here, this is taken from a picture of Jesus and the apostles from around 300. We have very little imagery or anything from this earliest time period. There's just very little before Christianity becomes this state religion, and then suddenly there's a huge expansion and change and everything happens. And so for this, we have to kind of piece a lot of things together from what sources we do have. So I'm trying to use as early sources as we have in terms of imagery, but even doing any images are somewhat anachronistic because these are coming later mostly. So this is definitely a later icon of Jesus. From 5th or 6th or something like that century. So in the early Christianities in the New Testament, their relationship here. So Jesus and early Christians were marginal people within the Roman Empire. Obviously, they aren't empowered leaders, and so they aren't having to make decisions about whether or not to go to war or any such thing. They're not in the kind of position of power. The original Jesus movement that exists prior to what we call Christianity. So Jesus is not, although we maybe think of him in this way, Jesus is not a Christian. Christianity as a religion doesn't exist until after Jesus' execution. So Jesus is an Israelite. He's, it's a Jewish religion or Judean religion. It's hard, if you say Jewish, Second Temple Rabbinic Judaism post-Second Temple Rabbinic Judaism also doesn't exist yet, but it's a proto version of that. So anyway, he's of that religion. He's in the 30s and 40s. His movement is in that time period in different parts of the Roman Empire. Galilee, which is a mixed zone in the north of Israel, Palestine. And so essentially this is a part that's semi-Hellenized, so it's already been ruled by Greek speakers for 300 years, and before that, the Persians. And so it's not, the local language is predominantly Aramaic as opposed to Hebrew, and then there's lots of Greek speakers as well. So between that, we have very little in terms of this movement itself. This Aramaic-speaking movement left us no texts. And so all of our understanding of this Jesus movement, this proto-Christianity, has to be reconstructed for us from the later Greek Christianity that emerges in the later first centuries, and then the texts into the second and third centuries. So after then, the execution of Jesus, early Christianity develops and quickly spreads among Greek-speaking peoples, most of whom are non-Jewish ultimately in the Roman Empire, who then define themselves with the texts that become the New Testament. And so I'm not going to focus too much on the Jesus movement here because we can only know so much about it. Instead, we'll look at Christianity from the beginning of when it emerges as a religion here. And so we do that kind of looking at the texts, especially the earliest texts which are included in the New Testament. So this early movement considers itself essentially to be a congregation of the poor, and so they often call themselves the poor, and they celebrate, they're actually there's some pretty blanket statements against wealth, as opposed to, let's say, war or slavery, which we don't get like a blanket condemnation of. There is some fairly substantial statements against wealth. And so there is a people who are, in some sense, celebrating their condition of being poor. They're also celebrating the meek and also roles like peacemakers. So among these Beatitudes, as they're called, that are contained in Matthew and also in Luke, so two of the canonical Gospels, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. This is one of those pictures I took on the vacation the last 2 weeks in Provence. I think this is in Arles. So Arles has the largest collection of late antique, early Roman anyway, Christian sarcophagi outside of the Vatican. And so there's all of these images on the coffins or on the sarcophaguses of early Christians that are essentially telling Bible stories. What you find is very interesting is in almost all of them, the picture of Jesus is pretty well just envisioned as a 4th century Roman and not bearded, right? So this beard image of Jesus comes later, and it's largely adopted from essentially the earlier image of Zeus and Jupiter. So essentially this idea that you have of the kind of the bearded king god Jesus is kind of almost pulled over directly from Zeus and Jupiter.
Is he like a shepherd?
Yeah, so this is a shepherd picture. So he's got, a lamb right over, and he's essentially the good shepherd who's gone and found the one lamb that had gotten away. While the 99 were wandering around, who knows doing what, and brought the one back, right? So the good shepherd. Okay. So among all those other writings then, in that same thing about, like I say, blessed are the peacemakers, another famous one here is a revision of the Lex Talionis, or the law of retaliation, that is found in Leviticus. So Jesus says here, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also, and if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. So some strong insistence here on not retaliating, on especially possibly not seeking justice in the court system, but rather, in this case, avoiding any those kind of suits. And then also even in the case of the being forced to go 1 mile, essentially if you're being drafted into government service, that you fulfill that service and even go a 2nd mile, according to this. Another one of these is in the same kind of gathering here in the Gospel of Matthew. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends the rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. And so this is, we've done before when we did a lecture on the book of Job and the development of providential and reflective wisdom traditions in the ancient Israelite tradition. Essentially, Proverbs will tell you, this is the prudential one, and these will tell you things like, don't trust your enemies because no good is going to come of that. So you watch your back, that kind of thing. Those kind of proverbs, which are common sense kind of wisdom. But then the kinds that we have in books like Job are aware, for example, that just because you lead a good life doesn't mean that good results are going to happen to you. The rain is going to fall on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Very dastardly people may well get really rich. It doesn't just immediately follow that if you're good, you'll have good ends and good results.
What's the picture of?
Oh, this is Jesus again. And so in this case, Jesus is on, again, one of these sarcophagus from Arles. In this case, it's a part of a broader picture where he is in the trial in front of Pontius Pilate. And so there's a little thing of water here because Pontius Pilate has just washed his hands of the whole thing. But it's just another one, again, where Jesus is kind of like wearing a Roman toga, and he doesn't have a beard, right? And so he is in the guise in these early images, essentially, of the young philosopher. So as opposed to one of the other images with the beard is the older philosopher who's kind of that kind of a teacher, and also the bearded guy is also the king, right? So he's also like Zeus or Jupiter or the emperor. In this case, it's essentially the young philosopher who's going around. Also, on a lot of these images, he's got a big wand and he does the different tricks or miracles. So essentially he heals people, or he turns water into wine, or with the wand, or he multiplies bread. And so he's the same kind of this kind of era of Roman iconography of like a wonder worker, which is to say also a philosopher, since there's a big overlap at this point as far as the Romans are concerned between people who, on the one hand, work wonders and or are scientists, and so essentially astrology and astronomy are exactly the same thing. And so that's also where this imagery comes from. So Jane, yeah.
And what is that ghost-like figure behind Christ?
So there's just, it's a Roman guard. So a Roman guard is back here, so he's holding him because he's a prisoner. So he's being tried in front of Pilate. I just cut this little image out. It's actually a bigger image. There's 3 Romans behind him, and Pontius Pilate is right here in that image. And I just cut it out to show the Jesus image there. Okay, so an alternate saying, and if you've read a relatively recent biography of the historical Jesus or study of it called Zealot, the author there makes a big case about, for example, passages that are like this one, which are, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but the sword." And so this is like an alternative, let's say, text maybe, and reading than these other ones that are all about, nonviolence and peace. So depending on which verses you're going to pluck out of the complex Gospels, you can find and say different things about what ancient Christian or proto-Christian teachings. And there's a bunch of sword imagery in early Christianity, including the angel, Michael, who's the main archangel, has always got a sword, right? Because it's part of, that's his identifier as an angel. Gabriel has got the horn because he's a herald, and et cetera, et cetera. So, however, one of the points of the sword imagery is that the sword is often in early Christianity a metaphor for the word. And so it's not always going to be the case, but for example, in Revelation, the sword that's wielded by the heavenly rider of the horse who emerges from the mouth in the Battle of Armageddon, the reason why a sword is coming out of your mouth is because it's the word that you're bringing forth. And so essentially by bringing all of these teachings, by bringing this gospel, that's causing the metaphorical sword here. and that's made explicit in one of Paul's letters here, Ephesians. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, right? So the idea is that the sword here possibly is the Word or the gospel. And so in this case, the idea then would be, I'm not coming to bring peace, I'm coming to bring a sword. The idea here, the sword being an unsettling message. Not something that's complacent. So after he says, I come to bring a sword, not peace, it continues here, the next portion of that saying, for I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. So the idea here is that this word or this sword, this teaching, this discipleship of this in this movement is going to be divisive, and it's going to cut across all of your traditional family groupings. And so if you have been complacent in your central lived identity up until this time as a Galilean person where you are obliged to family for all sorts of obligations, now that we are bringing forth a different kind of ethical message where you're trying to rethink all of those connections and obligations, in some senses those are all going to be cut off, and you're no longer going to be able to do things where you're living your life for familial obligation that you might have inherited, possibly as an interpretation of this. So an example of that kind of sense is also found in the Gospel of Matthew, where another of disciples said to Jesus, Lord, let me go and bury my father. What Jesus said to him, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. So this has been pretty well the most kick somebody in the nuts kind of thing that you could possibly say in the ancient world, because the obligation to bury, for example, your father is pretty much the center of what piety even means. And so if the idea here is to, even essentially following in this new movement or being involved in this thing that's going to eventually become Christianity, involves just letting aside all of your past obligations up to and including burying the dead. This is meant to, really, shake your complacency. Mustafa, you were going to say?
Yeah. In the previous slide, there's the last sentence.
Yes.
And whomever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me.
Yes.
Where is the cross coming from?
Yes.
I wondered that too.
So like I say, the text here is a good point. I really like that. So the idea here is when we have the New Testament texts, Matthew here, this is written, whatever this is, it's 50, 60 years after Jesus' death. And so in this particular, take up the cross and follow me, I'm trying to think if that's from Q. So that would be earlier, but in any event, that's written after Jesus' death. And so this is an example of, it's hard to argue that this was a saying before all of Jesus' followers knew that Jesus was going to be crucified, but after that historical event, which is multiply attested. So people are pretty clear that of the historical Jesus, one of the things that we could say about the figure is that he was executed by the Romans, and that form of execution is probably crucifixion. That's pretty well known. And so in this case, this is a saying that's put into Jesus' mouth that anticipates that fate. And so either it's a saying that is created by his followers ex post facto, or if people want to make the argument that Jesus is a prophet who is able to predict these kind of things because of supernatural means, then that would be how they would understand that. But essentially that's what the idea of it is. And so essentially this is also a model for one of the ways early Christians have to come to terms with what ends up happening. So Jesus' movement wasn't necessarily intended to lead to Jesus being executed like that, and that may have, when that happened, for a lot of the members who had been following him around and disciples and things like that, this was a crisis moment when they tried to figure out, why did this happen? This was not what we were anticipating with this movement as we understood this person to be the Messiah. This wasn't what we were expecting to happen to the Messiah and this kind of a thing. In which case then part of the idea is how do they interpret it? And so one of the ways that people are interpreting this is taking up your cross and following Jesus. So Jesus as a model of martyrdom, as a model of how you were able to give yourself all the way to the point of death as a symbol that you're standing for truth and righteousness, right? And so previous models of that in the Israelite tradition include the books from the book of Maccabees. There's the mother of the Maccabees, who, like all of her 7 children or whatever, are sons one after another, are all essentially massacred and martyred. And so that was like a model for martyrdom. And so in the same way, then there are sayings preserved in the New Testament that are coming along this, that Jesus is a prophet who was executed, because that's what people always do to true prophets. And so his execution seals his testimony and shows that in fact, after the fact, that it was truth. And in that same sense then, for many early Christians, them becoming martyred or them being killed for their beliefs shows that likewise, and gives them this position where they will be with the elect and the first among the first that are raised in the resurrection. Yes.
I'm just wondering too if, there was some editorializing on the part of Matthew, wherever he was, with this idea of the cross being written backwards into the historical event.
Yeah.
Is it possible also that perhaps there was some, let's say, turmoil in the contemporary early Christian community at the time Matthew was written, such that it was setting families in turmoil, and that perhaps this was emphasized in order to address that problem?
Sure, very, very possibly. There definitely is conflict going on at this time period. And so each one of the different writers, when we have all of the different early Christian writers, each one of them is writing for their own purpose and goals to their own community, and they're addressing their own community's needs. And so in a lot of cases, they are preserving, they're either preserving memory of something that other people don't have because it's more important to what their community's understanding of the past is, or in other cases, they are inserting text into the mouth of the founder in order to make their own case. And so this, I come not to bring peace with a sword, this isn't in the other Gospels, right? It's one of the things that Matthew, it's important for Matthew's community, and so Matthew has written it into his Gospel. Likewise, the other ones like that are, so right in the middle of all this, Matthew also has a statement that I come not to end the law, but to fulfill it, and that not one jot or one tittle will be taken away from the law. And so this is a major conflict in early Christianity, where Paul has written very seriously to his congregations that if you focus on the law, then you're essentially rejecting Christ and everything that Christ did and his sacrifice and everything is for. Whereas Matthew's arguing quite the opposite, that if you're rejecting the law, if you're not embracing every single thing about the law and then doing Christianity on top of that, you've missed out on the message. And so those are diametrically opposed statements, both of which are in the canonical New Testament. Yep.
And I wonder if you can just take it literally, because a sword is in the shape of a cross, and the whole passage talks about separating families and separating your previous relations. So if you look at it literally, picking up the cross could just mean picking up the sword, right?
Yeah, it could
It follows
It could
from...
be, to the extent that it's, like you say, it's to the extent that these are all together as a composite piece as opposed to individual fragments of of things that Matthew stuck together. But yeah, in that sense, it could also be visually talking about division, so dividing the two. The sword is dividing, and so this is a somewhat literal but also metaphor for division.
I don't think anybody saw a cross when they looked at a sword until Christianity.
Okay. Well, now when you see a lightsaber, you see the cross, right? Yes.
Sorry, is this passage in all four Gospels, or is it just in Matthew?
So I'm pretty confident that this "take up the cross and follow me" section, I think, is multiply attested. So that part might be in more than one, but I'm pretty sure that this one is only in Matthew, this component of it. And so what ends up happening is that different components of, let's say, the oral tradition, if these are remembered pithy sayings or something like that, those will get rearranged by the different evangelists so that they can focus on, let's say, a particular topic. And so Matthew will lump all these different things that he thinks are important together, and Luke will do them in a different order and things like that. So not all of these are multiply attested. Okay, so here's some of the. So anyway, what we're pointing out in all of those is, on the one hand, yes, we have these kind of teachings, radical teachings of turn the other cheek and love your enemies. On the other hand, there's some complexity here with not bringing peace, bringing division, and also overturning social convention. Another component in early Christianity is that Christians are understanding Jesus after the fact, or maybe during his life, as the Messiah. And so one of the ways that they understand then his entire life is by going back and reading the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, and reading essentially all of the various, actually the whole text, as being predictive of Jesus' life. And so all kinds of different ways when we read the gospel accounts of the narrative of different things that are happening in Jesus' life, a lot of these are constructed out of Psalms, they're constructed out of imagery that prophets like Isaiah are having. And so one of the ways that happened is that when those details were unknown, the Christian writers who were constructing the gospel narratives have this sense that all of these Old Testament passages are predictive of Jesus' life, and so they can just go and look them up and insert them because they know that that's how it would have happened, because that's how the different prophets predicted it would happen. And so one of these core ones here is from Isaiah 9:6, and this is, if Leander was here, he'd sing this for us because he loves this particular, Elizabeth can sing it, from the Handel's Messiah. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest upon his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. So essentially, then this idea that this image that is found in Isaiah refers to Jesus as far as early Christians are concerned, and so therefore it's part of this imagery is that Christ is the Prince of Peace. So one of the components then of this early Jesus movement that evolves into early Christianity is this idea of being inclusive of communities of the unclean. So part of being an observant Second Temple Judean is operating with certain ritual purity laws or kosher laws, kind of thing, Mosaic law, and that included excluding from meals and other kinds of things people who are ritually unclean. Early Christians, by contrast, were pretty focused, as we read in both what they're doing in the New Testament and also Jesus' various teachings, that people who are ritually unclean should be included in the congregation, including such people as tax collectors, prostitutes, but then also soldiers who, again, are being ritually unclean because they're in this encountering death and causing death. So an example that's written into the Gospels here again is a story of Jesus encountering a Roman soldier. So when Jesus entered Capernaum, a Roman centurion came to him, appealing to him and saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed in terrible distress." And he said to him, "I will come and cure him." The centurion answered, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and the slave does this." When Jesus heard him, he was amazed and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And to the centurion Jesus said, "Go, let it be done for you according to your faith." And the servant was healed that hour. So essentially, this is then kind of showing anyway, by writing a story into the gospel account, of Jesus then actually interacting with the soldier, just saying that among the different communities of people who might otherwise be considered ritually unclean or would be outcast, would not be allowed in, that's not going to be true for Christianity. So, that said, so although we don't have then a clear condemnation of being a soldier or war or things something like that in the gospel accounts, when early Christians got to thinking and writing about these things, some of our earliest writers are kind of committed to the idea that military service and Christianity are not compatible. So Tertullian, who's a second and early 3rd century writer, says there's no agreement between the divine and the human sacrament, the standard of Christ and the standard of the devil, the camp of light and the camp of darkness. He's a very dualistic or good and evil kind of guy, black and white Tertullian. There's no overlap between the temple and the academy, between Jerusalem and Athens. There's other kinds of things that he likes to say. But anyway, one soul cannot be due to two masters, God and Caesar. How will a Christian man war? Nay, how will he serve even in peace without a sword which the Lord has taken away? So Christians can't be involved in war as far as Tertullian here is concerned. Be serving Caesar, who is a pagan at this point. So, other early thinkers who kind of say something similar, Origen, who's another very important early Christian thinker, he's also against Christians serving in the Roman military. That said, however, as in the story with the centurion, many soldiers did convert and continued to serve in the military even though they were Christians. And in fact, some of our earliest archaeological remains of Christian churches. So we have very little actually archaeological stuff from these first few centuries, but two of the more important early Christian churches in the East are associated with with Roman military camps. So one here at Megiddo and another one at Teropus. Anyway, so it's on the frontier in the military. So essentially, very early Christian symbol here of the fish, right, as opposed to a Jesus symbol in the 3rd century. And this is anyway in a Roman military camp. So the idea is that there are enough of the soldiers in the legion here to actually need a church. They've built a church in the camp. That's quite nice. Jane?
Any speculation on what would prompt the military men to join the Christian camp?
So yeah, the question is, why would these soldiers want to join Christianity? Why would they want to be involved in this? And so they may well be part of this, one of the early communities that where Christianity is very successful in spreading, is a community called the God-fearers. And these are people who, let's say, are Greek speakers, people who are otherwise would be like from the normal pagan population, but they are there in the East, they're aware of Judaism, they like the synagogues, they go to synagogue and they listen to the stories and the ethics and the idea of the one God. And so they are able to listen to that because it's all in Greek and they know Greek. But they are not able to join, right? Because you would have to do all this stuff. Like if you're one of these soldiers, you have to get circumcised. That's no fun in now, but in ancient surgery, less fun. There's all kinds of different reasons why it'd be real tough to actually officially join. But what Christians say is, oh no, you don't have to do all that. You can join and you can be a member and you won't have to worry about any of that kind of thing, and you'll be saved and you get to and after, let's say you have a battle and you're dead and you think of your own mortality. There's also this whole idea of resurrection and eternal life and that kind of a thing. And so those same kind of appeal that other people would have had, but for a soldier or somebody who's otherwise not allowed to, wouldn't be allowed to become Jewish or part of it, this is giving that person an opportunity. And so this is also just simply true for a lot of the legionnaires. In any event, you're away from your, let's say, traditional. If you're a pagan, you have like a traditional cult identity and things like that are based on household gods and your local community and everything like that. You're away from all of that and you're off on some alien frontier. And so you're way more interested in than these sort of international, or let's say what's now being called like world religions. And so the legionnaires are much more likely to, let's say, start becoming, they're going to join a Mithraeum, so they're going to start worshiping Mithras. Or some of them, maybe their centurion is a Christian, so they all join and become Christians. So there's all kinds of different religions that are like that, that appeal a lot to these kind of legionnaires.
And to their commanding officers.
And to their officers too. Yep. And in this case, to local wealthy women. So Christianity went and got anywhere without very wealthy widows who apparently there's a woman who patronized and actually paid for the making of this church. And so there was also a lot of an appeal for, in early Christianity, for wealthy women and widows. There's a lot of concern for widows in early Christianity. And so widows and women have a much more say in the religion, especially early on, than later when the church kind of succumbs to the surrounding patriarchal pressures of the empire. Okay, so just to get through the early period, because we got to go 5 more periods, and it's already been a little while. Okay, so there's a mixed view coming out of the gates in early Christianity. So although early Christians see Jesus as a Messiah, who is a Prince of Peace, who heralded the coming of a kingdom that's described as the peaceable kingdom, and they recorded many difficult teachings of Jesus, including love your enemies. And although key early thinkers were against Christian participation in war, nevertheless, we didn't, unlike the kind of several blanket statements that we get against things like divorce, against things like wealth, what we don't get here is we don't get a statement against slavery. We don't get statements against war that are blanket ones. And active Roman soldiers are permitted to become Christian, and in fact, seems like in the early centuries kind of joined in fairly significant numbers, to the point where at different times some of the persecutions of the emperors, like the Decian persecution, the emperors themselves are concerned that too many of their troops maybe are already Christian. And they aren't necessarily sure that they're going to even be able to purge it out of the ranks, because they're afraid that some of the soldiers are going to rebel because they're Christian. So that's kind of that first period. Then, of course, with Constantine, everything is going to change. Like history always, everything changed because of Constantine. So essentially, in 312, Constantine, who is one of the competing candidates for emperor, there's a bunch of different potential emperors at the time, he has a vision. He has a vision that he will, in this particular Christian symbol that he sees, he will have victory in the following battle and the Milvian Bridge. In response to that vision, Constantine had his soldiers paint the Christian symbols on their shields. Probably the symbol is more like what you think of that. You've maybe seen this is a papal symbol, but essentially there's an X with a P sticking out of it, which is to say Chi Rho, which is to say the first two Greek letters in the name Christos, Chi and Rho, on their shields, and then they enter battle against Maxentius, a rival for the imperial throne. The resulting military victory then led Constantine to convert to Christianity, and thus, forever changes the course of history. So one of the things, though, that's why this moment of considering what we've already had in terms of kind of like the mixed ideas that Christians at best, kind of pro-peace ideas that have led up to this moment, that the crucial moment here is actually a battle, and the battle where essentially there's a vision where Constantine believes that Christ has given him victory in battle. And so as a result of the divinity putting out, or whatever, essentially, that's in other words, as a result of the miracle actually happening, this is something that everybody is very interested in the 4th century. If your God is going to give you victories, then that's what you need in these circumstances. So at this point, and actually pretty much from the entire history of the institution of the emperors, our word emperor grows out of the Roman, the Latin word imperator, which just means general, right? And so initially, generals like Julius Caesar and Marius and Pompey and Sulla, essentially they're overpowerful, and that's how the emperorship evolves out of this idea of generals that are controlling armies. So ultimately, the idea of the emperor, the main task of the emperor is to essentially defend the frontiers, so commanding the legions all along the frontiers, but then also putting down all of the internal rebellions. And so that's really what the imperial government is really focused on, especially the position of emperor. So the conversion of the emperor meant that Christian ideas about military service quickly became a lot less theoretical than they had been before, when most everybody could just be a Christian. You're in a tiny minority within an empire. You can be like Tertullian in Origin and say, well, Christians shouldn't serve in the military because there's a whole bunch of pagans who could go off and serve in the military. Now things are going to be quite different. So in this whole, we can just say, just in Constantine's own case, so one of the practices that kind of happens at this time because of this ongoing ambiguity is because Constantine is continuously involved in the business of being an emperor. That means he's involved in war, that means he's involved in killing people and all this kind of thing. He himself then, following this kind of 4th century Christian practice, he puts off being baptized until essentially the very last minute, because his idea is that when that baptism happens, it's kind of a one-time washing away of all sin. So all the things that he would have done before in terms of being in the military or anything like that, he may have been, and like many of the Roman soldiers, they may well have been completely active Christians, but they would be unbaptized Christians, and then they would get baptized, right at the end, and then try not to sin anymore afterwards, in as much as possible. And so this is why in this kind of time period, the most important Christian things that come out are these baptistries. And so if you look at these old Christian edifices that have survived, it's very often like baptistries and things like that. So anyway, though, into this atmosphere, then we have Augustine, who we often get to as this amazing thinker of the 5th century. First major Christian theologian and philosopher on almost everything, but anyway, one of the things he's done is to consider warfare systematically. So we'll take a little detour into how he does that. And so essentially he identifies two aspects of war that required moral justification and guidelines. Essentially, he divides this into the right you have, whether or not you can be justified to go to war, use ad bellum, and then the right sorts of conduct in war. So how do you justly have a war so the use in bello? Yeah.
St. Augustine?
Yeah, this is St. Augustine. So, and of Hippo, it just means this is he was bishop of Hippo, which is a city in North Africa near Carthage. And it's just to identify him from the other Augustines, like Augustine of Canterbury. The big St. Augustine, though, is who we're talking about. So St. Augustine argued, or just taught, that the right to go to war concerns the justification that a nation has or has to give in order for it to have a moral right to wage war on another nation. And so he lays out 4 main criteria. So 1, You have to have just authority, he says, is the decision to go to war based on a legitimate and legal process. So you can't just be, I don't know, random thieves who are deciding to go wage war on people and plunder them. You have to actually have some kind of legal authority to declare war. Just cause, has a wrong been committed with which war is the appropriate response. So things like somebody invaded you, you respond by doing that. Right intention, is the response proportional to the cause? So in other words, is the war action limited to righting the wrong and going no further? So kicking the people out who have invaded you, maybe stopping them from being able to keep on invading you, but not going and exterminating them or something like that, which would be like some kind of disproportionate response to it. And finally, last resort, has every other means of righting the wrong been attempted sincerely so that no other option but war remains? So have you done exhausted all of those kind of diplomatic channels? So in some ways, this is also a theory of unjust war, right? And so it's usually called Augustine's theory of just wars, but in fact, and it's in part because once you kind of open the door and say, well, some wars are justified, then usually people just drive the train through the door and all the wars end up getting justified. But in a lot of senses, the idea here is that a lot of these are limited, right? So the same thing too, once you've decided that it was legitimate, according to Augustine, to go to war, then the conduct of how you go to war is still also of moral concern. So Augustine says that even if you were justified in waging war on another nation, there are limits on what you can do in order to prosecute the war morally. So that includes, to define and enforce those limits, that's a concern for international agreement on law. So the characteristics that Augustine outlines for this is, again, proportionality. So the proportionality of the use of force in war, the degree of allowable force used in war has to be measured against the force required to correct the just cause and limited by, by the just intention. So if you just start, nuking everybody, so it's out of control for what the proportionality is. Discrimination, so you have to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. You're not supposed to just go around and terrorize civilian populations. So innocent non-military people should not be the target of attacks in a just war, according to Augustine. Responsibility, a country is not responsible for the unaffected side effects of its military activity as long as the following three conditions are met. So this is trying to limit unintended consequences. In some cases, you can get paralyzed if every single thing that you do leads to something else, and ultimately something bad's going to happen as one of the consequences. But anyway, so the action must carry the intention to produce good consequences. So you're supposed to want things to be good. So although in Christianity the road to hell is paved with these good intentions, right? But anyway, so the bad effects were definitely not intended, so you didn't want the things that happened to do. And the good of war has to outweigh the damage done by it. So you have to imagine that if you hadn't done this thing, something more horrible was going to happen, like somebody was going to have committed genocide or some kind of horrible thing was going to happen that a targeted war was able to stop. Yep.
Sorry, I was just going to ask if you think that this is where Thomas Aquinas came up with his principle of double effect? From this?
Yeah. Yep, I think so. So I wanted to put in, we'll have run out of time, but I wanted to put Aquinas as then after. So Augustine really dominates all this thought until 1,000 years later, or whatever it is, that Aquinas, then adds in and kind of builds on what Augustine had been saying and adds more criteria and formulates more things. And I would have liked to add him in, but we're not going to do it today. So we'll have a whole Aquinas lecture in the future. So essentially, that takes us then through, essentially Augustine's thought here takes us through this period of Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire, and then the collapse of that state, and into then what do the Romans do in this kind of post-imperial world that they have in the West, as the different components of what had been the eternal empire are now carved up into independent or little barbarian kingdoms. So essentially, what happens historically is Germanic bands, military confederations essentially took service with the empire. And so ultimately, the empire is having, as it has the empire is facing in any event a population and economic decline. And so one of the things that's happened is because of things like mass slavery, income inequality, a bunch of different plagues, the western provinces are substantially depopulated over earlier heights that they'd had in the 1st and 2nd century. And so one of the things that's happened then on the other side of the Rhine is that the Germans and tribes have been trading with the Romans, and so they've had a lot more prosperity. In the meanwhile, people like the Huns run in off the steppes, and that pushes everybody nobody wants to be on the same side of the frontier as the Huns, and so everybody wants to run on the other side of the frontier at this point. And so in the meantime, the Romans have less military force that's indigenous anymore, so they have less citizen soldiers available to them because of this large slave holdings of the different villas. So they don't have as much in the way of little citizen farmers that they used to have. And so now they're instead having Germanic mercenaries as their own troops anyway. And so it's not as big a deal in a way that you just have essentially your own kind of Germanic troops on your side of the border when another whole confederation can kind of come in and be your mercenaries and be troops again on your side of the border. But then at a certain point, they all kind of get the sense, well, we could be here and fight the Huns for you, or we could just go move to, Carthage, where there aren't any Huns, and where we could just, live there and rule and be quite rich and happy. And so then essentially people like the Vandals run from all the way over in Bulgaria, vandalize Rome a little bit, but anyway, get all the way over and move to living in Tunisia, where they establish a very happy little Vandal kingdom, and that kind of a thing. So that's essentially what ends up happening. All these individual little kingdoms exist then within the former frontiers of the Western Empire. Essentially then what happens is the kings and their bands or the confederates take over the emperor's military role and the former role of the legions, and as a result there's a separation essentially of that military role from the what exists left, the remnants of the Roman state. All the civic functions that are in the cities. These Germanic tribes aren't really interested in the cities, and they kind of keep clear of them. And as the cities contract, essentially the people who take over all of the different civic functions that used to be happened by the Roman or municipal government are essentially done by the bishops and the church government, which is essentially the remaining Roman officials as Roman civilization kind of retreats into declining cities and then also into the monasteries. So for the next then several hundred years, the West continues to be on the offensive. And although they're armed, as we've seen, with Augustine's ideas of just war, the Christian West then actually lacks a developed idea of holy war. So as you kind of read about that, it's only that war theory that Augustine is having is not to say that a war becomes holy or justified in a kind of what you think of as a holy war sense. It's rather more of a philosophically, how are you morally allowed to do that? When, for example, then the Christians first encounter the forces of Islam. And so in the West, that happens over here in Spain, as opposed to what's happening in the East with the Byzantines. So one of the ways that kind of plays out then in the earliest frontier battles here in the Iberian Peninsula is the local leaders on what we kind of maybe think of in the maps now are this culture clash between Christendom and Islam. The local leaders on the frontier are not seeing it anywhere near like that. Rather, what will often happen is that Christian knights will take service with Muslim emirs, and Muslim fighters, again, mercenaries, will go into the service of different Christian kings. The emir of Caesar Augusta, Saragossa, as it becomes Caesar Augusta, anyway, ends up, for example, choosing to become a vassal of Charlemagne in order to get out of the taxation of the emir of Cordoba, right? And so as a result of that, even, for example, if El Cid, who is later remembered as essentially a crusader, he actually spends his early years in the service of different Muslim lords, and he ultimately, by intermarrying with some of them, he ultimately goes and becomes essentially he's the leader of Valencia, the Muslim emirate of Valencia. So it's really not this crusade idea that later happens in Spain at this earliest time period. So that's essentially takes us through this era of the invasions and into now the emergence of that kind of crusading idea in the higher Middle Ages, in the Central Middle Ages. So after all of this kind of centuries of decline, population, and also economic, the West really began to experience substantial growth with the turning of the millennium. So we don't think of Gothic architecture as being modern architecture like it was called at the time. But it was called the modern style cathedral here, like Chartres in the 12th century. These are the windows from Chartres. If you look at it, we realize even looking back, when we think of this stuff as medieval, this isn't just replicating what the Romans had been doing, right? So now suddenly this looks very different. What they'd been doing all the way up until this time with Romanesque building, they'd been able to replicate some of what the Romans had done, and there was some advance on it, but in general they weren't able to build anything of the same size that had happened. Now they're building taller, they're building things that have new forms, this pointed arch, these flying buttresses, these vast windows that weren't possible with the kind of vaulting that had been available and things like that for the Romans. And so anyway, so there's this advances that are happening architecturally, technologically, but also economically, and also population as the population explodes here. And so meanwhile, that also means that there's the landowning class, the emerging nobility, and emerging what becomes the knightly class. These guys also have lots more wealth than they ever would have had in the dark times because everybody's richer. And what they've inherited, though, is that their whole role kind of in society is military, right? And so they've essentially inherited out of that kind of it's not really a separation of church and state, but a separation of spheres, where essentially the old Roman officials that have come into being the church, their position is the ecclesiastical, and so their role is to pray. These Germanic nobility that essentially that becomes their descendants of this knightly class or the royal class, their position is to, and or role in society is to fight. So to fight, to pray, and then of course on the position of the people who had been the slaves, the serwi, but who now have their slavery commuted into serfdom, and so they have various, so serf is our word for it, but it comes from the Latin, originally had been slave, so is to work, and that's the huge bulk of the society who just has to do all the work, right? Jane?
Any idea where the new architecture took its origins from?
So the question is, where did the new architecture take its origins? And so Chartres is pretty early, but the earlier one that is the model for this is Saint-Denis. So if you've been to the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, that's a little north of Paris, and so this is the abbey that the great Abbot Suger, who had been the essentially the vizier of the kings, the Capetian kings of France. Essentially, Suger just gathers, like all the best craftspeople and things like that, and builds a new style according to the kind of values that they're trying to have. Essentially, they're trying to solve problems, which is to say build higher, and they're also trying to have more window space than had ever been possible. And they're also interested in new kinds of vaulting and things like that. And so they experiment with it. They build higher. They have regular buttresses. Then they make the buttresses flying. So you can see the advancing of the style as they kind of are trying for these different things.
And not many of those elements come directly from the Muslim tradition.
Oh, so yeah. The question is, did these emerge out of contact with Islam?
Yeah.
And so I think that these particular elements of the flying buttress and things like that are not emerging from contact with Islam, although lots of other things are. So one of the whole reason of the West becomes wealthy is really all of the all the trade that reemerges in the centuries before this. So essentially the fact that the Amalfitans, the Venetians, the Genoese, who are they trading with? They're trading with this rich Muslim world, and so then that's causing this kind of resurfacing of trade. There is all kinds of stuff that contact with Islam is really doing for intellectual reawakening and renaissance in this time period, including things like revolutions in Western medicine, philosophy, logic, all those kind of things are coming because of texts that the Muslims in Spain, they've gotten from the Muslims in Spain, which is essentially like Aristotle and all that kind of thing. In this particular case, though, I don't think that this has been pulled from that. Okay, so one of the things that does also happening at this same time period of this expansion is there is the emergence of this reformed papacy. So the papacy, the bishops of Rome, had been really at a low point themselves. We did that when we did the Pope Joan lecture a month or so ago. And so but from out of kind of a real low water mark that the papacy hit, it really got really fast uptick into very able reformers by the end of the 11th century. And so among these, very famously, is Pope Gregory VII, after whom this Gregorian reform movement is named. And so Gregory, in the West, there had long been an argument, essentially, that there are two swords. The spiritual sword, so that sword that I've been talking about before, like that's the word that's coming out of the mouth and things like that. But then there's also this temporal sword that had been in the hands of the emperors and also the German kings and all of these kind of Germanic nobles. Now, in terms of as the papacy is recovering Roman law and is essentially deciding that the popes are the successors of the emperors, they're essentially realizing, or they're theorizing, or Gregory is asserting, that the popes, in fact, have control over both the swords. And who does the emperor get the power, the temporal power from, if it's not as a fief, essentially, from the popes? And so the popes, in addition to then essentially delegating the temporal sword to temporal leaders like the emperor and kings, also is deciding, according to Gregory, who's worthy to be in those positions. And so this famously, this conflict between Gregory and Emperor Henry IV, at this moment, at a certain moment, Gregory excommunicates Henry and also then declares him no longer to be emperor, no longer to be king, and dissolves all of the oaths of allegiance, all of the fealty that any of Henry's subjects owe to him, essentially causing a crisis and almost collapse of the empire. And so in this kind of famous incident, Henry was able to counteract this kind of temporal devastation as all of his enemies essentially rise up and take this as a legitimate way to rebel against him. Henry goes to the Pope at Canossa, and he wears sackcloth, and he kneels for 4 days in the snow in order to be a penitent. And so having done that and having submitted very physically and graphically to the Pope had no alternative but to then lift the excommunication. And as soon as he did that, then Henry went back and all the rebels, he got to go put down all the rebels. He killed essentially all of the Pope's allies, among the temporal guys. And so later, when he refused to do the things that the Pope said and the Pope excommunicated him again, then nobody believed it the second time, right? So he was able to kind of show the limitations of what the Reformed papacy wanted to be able to do. That said, this is a pretty powerful thing that the Pope has kind of latched onto at this moment. And so anyway, this control or theoretical control over the temporal sword. And so this merges fairly quickly in the Reformed papacy. A soon successor of Gregory is Pope Urban. I think it should be Urban II. I just had that from Gregory. Anyway, calls the First Crusade in 1099, which results in an armed pilgrimage which conquered the Levantine coast, essentially Lebanese and Syrian and Palestinian coast, from local Muslim rulers. So when that happens successfully, when the popes have this idea that the temporal sword can be used, this slide comes first to be first. Anyway, essentially, we'll come back to it. When that happens, that the temporal sword could be used, warfare that had existed in places like Spain now become cloaked in this idea that now this is a crusade. And so now it's no longer going to be able to be the kind of fun fighting that they had before. Now it's religiously motivated fighting from the two sides, and essentially at a certain point, more or less, it's not just local people in Spain that are having little wars with each other for local effect. The French get involved on the one side as crusaders, and then the Almoravids, the people from Africa, get involved on the Muslim side, and it's no longer fun and games anymore. Anyway, in places like Spain, Turkey, the Balkans, and then against pagans in Lithuania, they all then take the character of crusades or holy wars as opposed to just wars. So just to back up a second on this slide, I mean, churchmen had already, before this idea of crusade, they tried to limit warfare among Christian nobles. So I said that essentially the nobles had the idea that their calling was to fight, but essentially by saying the church now starts to theorize, well, couldn't you be doing that fighting for good, or couldn't there be a good end to it as opposed to just fighting in order to steal stuff from your neighbors and everything like that? And so there had been this idea that that of the truce of God, where essentially they'd get together in big groups and bishops would get the different sides to all swear together on holidays like Easter that you're not going to have a war on Easter, that you're going to limit it to particular non-holy days when you could be having the fighting, that you won't do certain things, so like you're going to avoid just always sacking the monasteries, that you're going to avoid, so much of the raping and this kind of thing, and instead it's going to be more of just fighting against other nobles or something like that, these kind of things. So this had been the idea of trying to limit the kind of very all-out warfare that had happened. Now they're taking from that truce of God that gets focused to, well, wait a second, you guys could really be doing this whole fighting thing that you like to do against enemies of Christendom, and suddenly that would then be not just a just war, but it would be a holy war. Okay, so once though, the idea of, war, holy war against the external enemies, in that same way that I mentioned, once you kind of have a theory of war can be justified morally, like Augustine had, and I said that essentially once you have that, people drive a train through it, and now all wars are kind of justified without, you thought, well, we sort of tried to be good about it and that kind of thing, but anyway, it's not a way. In the same way, once crusades and holy wars exists as an idea, it doesn't take long at all for this to get repurposed in all kinds of ways. So the papacy has that political tool, and that's the hammer that the Pope is holding, and now everything's a nail. And so essentially the Crusades are called against heretics, so Christians who are not in communion with the Orthodox practices of the Church. So the Cathars, the Albigensians of southern France. There's a crusade that's called, and essentially the nobles of northern France realize that there's all kinds of booty and free lands to be had if they go essentially on this justified holy war, and so they massacre all the different people in the south as much as possible in order to stake out their own, grab the lands for themselves. Likewise, then, once that kind of a thing has been done, the popes also have political enemies like these emperors who they keep having fights with, and so at a certain point, wars that the popes are having against emperors are also dubbed crusades and take on that same kind of character. And of course, again, once people are running around crusading, they can kind of lose focus pretty fast. So pretty famously, the Fourth Crusade is responsible for the sack of Constantinople. Essentially, the Crusaders get hijacked by the Venetians. The Venetians are interested in conquering Byzantium. And the Crusaders aren't totally disinterested in that because of all the wealth. And so this city that had been the greatest city in Christendom for 500, 700 years or whatever, and had never fallen previously, it's sacked then by Christian crusaders. And ultimately that's a blow that the Eastern Roman Empire never really recovers from. So although eventually the Greeks do take it back and kind of refound Byzantium, and it holds out until 1453, essentially it never recovers from this blow. Crusade enthusiasm also, of course, as we've seen in our previous lectures, resulted in all kinds of massacres, especially of Jewish populations in Europe, where local people felt like they wanted to be part of this crusading fervor, local Christians, and there was no way to get to find Muslims to attack and things like that, but they knew where the Jews were, and so they killed them. And so that was one of the ways that all of these got lost focus. One of the more amazing results of this creation of holy war is that the monastic ideal itself, and so this idea that it existed kind of in the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries as Roman noblemen and women and other people who were feeling that they have religious calling would retire from the world and take kind of holy vows to not participate in worldly things, and they'd go and live in essentially Roman villas that are repurposed as now monasteries, and where they're devoted to contemplation and the divine work and that kind of thing. That monastic ideal and those monastic rules now, with the creation of the Crusader states, with the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the other various holy orders, the Sword Brothers, the Teutonic Knights, they now take that monastic rule and monastic vows, but instead of having your job be to copy manuscripts or to sit around and sing Gregorian chants or to pray at different times, your purpose is now a holy war, essentially defending the Holy Land, but also attacking Muslim states to make more Holy Land, and that's kind of a thing. So essentially, clerics devoted to crusading warfare, which is essentially then almost complete reversal of what, the original ideal. So that brings us through like a pretty strong right turn or whatever that gets made in the Central Middle Ages to where are we since then, and we're running out of time. So fortunately, I didn't make a lot of slides for this because I was running out of time by this point too. But this is all stuff you're more familiar with. But essentially, 1492, is the year that Spain defeats Grenada, the last Muslim state on the peninsula. And so, because the northern kingdoms, the Christian kingdoms in Spain, had all of this experience essentially as the frontier is moving, and with this holy war that becomes a crusade, the Reconquista, and then colonizing the Muslim territories and ultimately also expelling non-Christians, or as we'll see with the Inquisition, forcing conversions and then persecuting people who they don't think are sufficiently converted, and ultimately, massacring and also kicking people out. In some ways, that experience then essentially directly segued into the kind of overseas colonialism that occurred and was born out of the other events of 1492. Sheen? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that prior to colonizing the Americas, the Spanish, after the defeat of Granada, colonized these islands off the coast of Africa. Yeah. And basically wiped out the native population. It was a complete genocide.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is, it's like the islands just outside of Morocco? The Canaries? Yeah. The Canary Islands? Yeah. Okay, and then also attacked into Morocco too, right? But anyway, maybe that's not until later. Anyway, but yeah, and so essentially that also happens fairly quickly right into, let's say, in Hispaniola. And so there's some initial peaceful relations that last a few months with the Arawak Indians that are in the natives that are in the Antilles and the West Indies as they come to be known. But that pretty quickly becomes enslaving everybody, killing everybody, and essentially all the native population of that whole initial area is pretty well all gone. Into that period, one of the things then that happens as well is that with the Protestant Reformation, the 16th century, this sets off a series of wars of religion within Europe that led to the deaths of over 10 million people in Europe. And so specifically, especially the 30 Years' War, is especially devastating, and in some cases like a third of the populations in many of the places, as in what's now Germany, but essentially the Holy Roman Empire is the main fighting ground between Protestant and Catholic powers, and then people kind of fighting for opportunism too, so not always on the one side or the other in terms of the religion. It ultimately led to Europeans kind of beating it out of each other, where it decided that they're not going to all be one particular church of Christianity anymore, but there will now be multiple different denominations in terms of pluralism. That more or less is the solution to the 30 Years' War. Essentially, the Treaty of Westphalia defines it that whoever the religion of the particular ruler, so the guys over here that had been the Teutonic Knights, they secularized, they became Protestant, and the people who then were the rulers, they became the Protestant rulers of Prussia as a result of that. Or if you're in Austria and the Habsburgs are ruling, the Habsburgs are Catholic, so then everybody there has to be Catholic. And so essentially there's an idea that there's going to be, though, you can be any one of these different denominations depending on what the ruler wants to be. And so there'll be not just one Christianity anymore. So essentially that brings us to then that idea of Christianity divided by Protestantism, Christianity kind of beating it out of itself, to the point of the period of the Enlightenment, and ultimately within that denominational pluralism of Western Christianity, to then a point where the church and the state are separated, and churches are cordoned off into their own little zone and have decreasing relevance, as we've seen, to the point where now in Europe, very few people are adherents to any particular denomination in terms of Christianity, and that's declining really fast in Canada as well. Anyway, to this place where we are now, where Christianities then are also freed from being state religions, and so therefore aren't called upon as often to go to war like you would if you're a state religion. On the other hand, and so that's allowed there to be, for example, churches like the Quakers that are in this peace tradition, where people are able to, let's say, reinterpret early Christianity to say these components of it do speak to us about nonviolence. Or, though conversely, there's also the kinds of Christianity that's caught up with, let's say, white nationalism in the United States, that can be very militant still and is drawing upon other components of Christian history. So essentially that's leading us then to the Christianities of today, again, where there's division, and also division within all of the different denominational bodies, and different ones can all decide kind of for themselves about how their understanding of militancy and which components of this kind of vast and problematic history that they want to be drawing from. And that leads us to kind of where are we today in terms of understanding of just war or holy war, or whether war is justified, or whether nonviolence should be the principle, or whether some wars like World War I, if you're invaded, if you're France and Belgium, so it's a just war then to respond. For Canada, is it just to then help other fellow democracies when they're invaded like that? Vietnam, the Iraq invasion. Less easy to justify. So. Valerie. And then Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether the fact that Christianity arose under the so-called Pax or Peace Romana, the Roman peace, might have affected the way the early Christians saw militancy and battling. It was not really available to them because they were living in a police state that had strongly defended borders, such that it never became an issue. And that would be as opposed to, let's say, some religion that might arise among a people that immediately have to do battle.
Yeah.
I'm thinking the early Muslim community.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. So, in fact, when we read about Tertullian and Origen, who and their kind of theoretical or philosophical, theological takes against Christians having military service, so they are in a very peaceful time in the empire that, like you say, is defended, by the emperors, by mostly pagan soldiers, and they are living in, let's say, Alexandria, which is just a city that is very far away from, at that point anyway, from any kind of fighting or being, the potential of being conquered by a foreign adversary. And so it's one of the things in Origen's argument. So Origen is writing against a pagan who says, you Christians are, you're essentially traitors to the state because you won't defend the state through military service. And Origen's kind of response is, well, we actually are helping more because we're, praying on behalf of the armies and on behalf of the emperors and this kind of a thing, and that's obviously putting the demons that are causing wars down a lot more than anything you guys are doing. And so, so that doesn't necessarily convincing to the pagan philosophers, and also it also doesn't describe, well, what do you do then if you guys were to suddenly take over the whole state? Nobody expected that to happen, but when it did happen, then this is why they had to come up with something a little more substantial with Augustine at that point. Elizabeth.
I think it's impossible for pacifists on any kind of, I hate to say this, on any kind of long-term basis to run a country. There's a passage, I'm citing from memory, in Ben Franklin's autobiography, where he was very amused. The Quakers were basically running Pennsylvania, as indeed they were. They started Pennsylvania, and they were in a position where the legislature really kind of had to buy munitions, specifically gunpowder. So they passed a resolution or made a law allocating money for grains, meaning gunpowder, but
Grains
they
of
didn't
powder,
say
but
so.
they didn't say which kind of grains.
They didn't say which kind of grains, and they had to choose: do we get involved in military things, or do we stay pacifists? And they decided to stay pacifists and got out of the business of governing.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking of a story I once read about Kennedy, JFK. He had a delegation from, I don't know who, I probably read this somewhere in Gallery Wills, from a bunch of do-gooders, religious people who were, I don't remember just what cause they were working for, but they made their case to him and he was very impressed. But then he came back and he talked about how he had to defend the country and how they needed nuclear weapons. Yeah, I think it was people fighting nuclear weapons. And they were even more impressed by him than he had been by them. And one of them said, "Mr. President, what can we do to help you?" And he thought about it and he said, "Maybe you shouldn't. There is a place for the pacifist opposition."
Coming back to the Crusade.
Yes.
And to that, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Oh, that's fine.
But I would like to bring a bit more behind the scene, what the reason also of the Crusade. And also I said that because I grew up in Belgium, which is the crossroad and the heart of Europe.
Yes.
And have been schooled from elementary school, so it means I received a very detailed history class.
Yes.
About the European history. And so also to mention, put in a bigger picture, because basically what happened is for a long time it was just the noble class and the civilians, poor people.
Yes.
Because all the Europe was divided by land and ruled by, noble
right.
people. Okay?
Yeah.
And then gradually started the rise of the cities.
Yes.
The cities, the towns.
Yes.
And then a new social class.
Yes.
So because now has a very negative connotation when we say bourgeois. But bourgeois means literally the bourg, the city.
Yes.
And then it's that new class of bourgeois
Yes.
And then socially, economically, they started to have the power.
Yes.
And so it means also the noble class start to decline,
Yes.
but more importantly, economically.
Yes. Yeah.
So it means also that, but there were still, in terms of reproduction, to have many children.
Yes.
So it means, but now what will happen to the elder one will inherit the land,
Yes.
not to divide, but
Yes.
how about the youngest one?
Sure. Yeah.
And then either they go to the monastery to become a priest, monk, etc.
That's right.
But how about the others?
That's right.
So, and then said that's why the church got that brilliant idea
Yeah.
in combination with that noble class,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
to compensate, and then to find a social role,
Yep.
but also economically, because they knew that the Arab world was exactly wealthy and much more advanced at many levels, but socially, economically, and the wealth, because the Arab world was also exactly already at the doorstep for the Silk Road and access to
Yes.
the Far East.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So that's why the Arab world was already very wealthy, and it was the way to do a kind of looting.
Yeah, like
But,
you
I mean, that's
like
behind
exactly
the
like you say.
scene.
So one of the things that has happened, where because like you say, there's a change in inheritance law, so they're no longer dividing holdings, and so therefore there's a whole bunch of younger sons. They can't all go to the monastery. They got to go somewhere, and so one of these things that has happened when I was like mentioning, part of the reason why. Europe was on the defensive all this time was because of an economic decline, economic and population and collapse. But once you start having, like you say, a population surplus that continued to increase up until plague, the Black Death actually brought it back to, anyway, it's a little more sustainable. They had to export people. And so like you say, the nobility was exporting people vastly into different crusading ventures, so to Spain, to southern Italy, to the Holy Land if they could, to fighting the Turks, to fighting the Lithuanians, wherever you could send people. Send from northern France to southern France, anywhere you could, Yep, good point. And then, like you say, warfare totally changes, everything changes in this modern era. We skipped over almost all of it, but like you say, with the rise of, at a certain point, the economic clout of the population, the merchant class, those kind of classes, the cities, it so overtakes, like you say, both in terms of demographics, then also economics, and then also finally military. So when essentially knights are by 1500 or something like that, they're completely obsolete and they're not helpful at all in war, although they still want to keep having these cavalry charges and things like that that are become increasingly absurd. And instead, you have these citizen armies that gets to the point where under Cromwell or Napoleon, where you suddenly you can have mass mustering, and that changes everything. So. Okay, well, I think we'll end the formal discussion and all that kind of thing, and we can go talk over snacks and things like that. And we will thank everybody who joined us online, and thank all of you.